Hello. So we have our first participant here. I can't actually really see how many participants there are. YouTube is being weird about that. But thank you for joining. Can you hear me okay? All right, great. If anyone else wants to say hi in the chat so I can see that you're here. Um, but yeah, we'll get going in just a minute. I'm gonna maybe put another thing on Instagram just real quick to let people know that we are live now, and then we will get started in just a second. I see AJC said Charles Adams is actually the first story you shared that I found. Yeah, it's a really interesting story. Were you like looking for stuff about Charles Adams? Are you just like generally interested in him, or how was it that you ended up finding that one? AJC said no, I stumbled across it. Well, I'm glad that you were able to find that. And yeah, I think um right now I'm adapting all of my early articles into podcast episodes, and so this is one of the ones that I did. Yeah, I several years ago now, I guess, like, almost 5 years ago, um, but, yeah, it was one of the first ones I did. I think it's a very interesting story, because, it's so close to a story that we hear about a lot. We hear a lot about John Adams and everything, and to find out there's this other story, this queer-related story that's so close to that one, but that we just don't hear about. JC said, I'm a non traditional student studying history and I want to focus on gender studies in the first century of the US. Yeah, queer history is definitely a part of that. And yeah, that's kind of what I've been studying too. Yeah, I study American history and I've been looking a lot at, yeah, gender and sexuality. Yeah, and I think like all of those are very important, parts of history that definitely get lost, and people often think of like women's history or LGBT history as kind of like a fun add-on to US history, but of course it's actually an integral part of that we lose so much of the story when we aren't including those parts. So it's almost 6:10, so I guess we'll get started here. um, Oh, I come in pieces of comments said, learning about queer history really opened my eyes as a historian. Yeah, it definitely, like, not only is it just like a thing that gets left out, but it also, I think, is very helpful in just sort of reframing the whole way that we look at history, and recognizing that often, like, kind of the views we have about history are not accurate, but just kind of like, sort of cliches that come up about history that we sort of assume that, everything was just like how we look at the 1950s, but worse, and that there was like no queer stuff or no acceptance, and also just like no one, rebelling against their society. And when we start looking at queer history, definitely, um, yeah, we see how like every era had like a lot of different stuff going on, stuff that fit with what society wanted to be and stuff that didn't, and varying opinions on what society should be, and just that kind of the whole way that we normally approach history is often not super accurate. So yeah, I think that queer history can definitely be a lens into all of that. All right, so yeah, we'll get started. Like with our last episode, I'm going to start by just reading the introduction that I had for the article originally. And then I'll get into telling the story more. Very few people have ever heard of Charles Adams. It is almost shocking to discover that this entirely forgotten man was part of the illustrious family of John and Abigail Adams. Charles was just as bright as any of his siblings. Why, then, was Charles left behind? Charles Adams's life was covered up. Though it started out with promise, Charles's life ended in scandal and pain, and his shining, celebrated family was not about to let him be a stain on them. So, yeah, I see a lot of people have a lot more thoughts on queer history here in the comments, and maybe we'll get into some of that more in a bit. But for now, moving on with the story of Charles Adams. So yeah, I mean, I had that very dramatic intro for my original article, and I definitely, I think I am pretty hard on the rest of Charles Adams's family here, and we can talk more about if that was fair. Um, but I do think that it's accurate for sure to say that Charles Adams got left behind and forgotten because, yeah, I feel like I had never even heard of him, or I feel like realized that John Adams, had any children who did anything other than John Quincy. So, yeah, Charles Adams was born in Braintree, Massachusetts on May 29th of 1770, born on the family farm. So yeah, we see some early kind of indications that he didn't really fit with his family. I found this like kind of weird anecdote where he actually traveled to France with his father and his brother John Quincy, and he ended up being sent home. Like John sent him home early. Like he traveled back across the Atlantic alone, while John and John Quincy remained in France. And it just kind of, I feel like an early, thing going on that we see that like he's frequently going to end up in like sort of weird disciplinary situations, and just his family kind of regarding him as like this reoccurring family problem. So yeah, he ended up going to Harvard like the rest of his family, and that's another place that we see quite the legacy of him getting into trouble. They've kept very thorough records of all of the times that students were disciplined. We have record of him being disciplined 11 times, sorry, for missing reciting, 9 times for missing prayer, him being marked as late to prayer, missing lectures, and then he was fined for extensive damage to Harvard property. So he managed to get into some very fun adventures there. He was also fined for miscellaneous other bad behavior and punished for sneaking off to a tavern. And then there's even Harvard legend that he started a tradition of running naked across Harvard Yard every year, which is still, I guess, a thing, or at least was for a while, that people did. And there was the legend that he had actually been the one who started that. So it's definitely, yeah, we're not what we're seeing from his siblings, and not what John and Abigail Adams are trying to teach their children to do. We see a lot throughout kind of their journey as parents, of them using shame to get their children back into line and get their children behaving in a properly manner, getting their sons to behave as gentlemen. And they tried this on Charles several points, including throughout his college experience, making clear to him that he was, letting down the family and being a disappointment, and not, growing up the way he was supposed to. So they continued to try this on him. And when he graduated, he did seem to like go through a period of kind of calming down. He was getting ready for his legal career, continuing his studies to become a lawyer. So we don't have any more records of him like getting to parties or running around naked. So he sort of calms down a little bit. But just as like things kind of seem like they're going better for him, we had this sort of weird situation where John Quincy Adams gets this letter from a friend, and I don't think we still have that letter, but he received this letter saying that Charles had been involved in some sort of situation that was kind of scandalous. He had done something. And so John Quincy Adams drops everything he's doing and like actually goes and travels to where Charles was living at the time to see him. So it seems like whatever this was like pretty serious, that John Quincy Adams just like kind of drops all the stuff he's involved in and runs to see Charles, to try and handle whatever the situation was. And John Quincy Adams updates the friend who let him know about the situation to begin with. And he says, converse with Charles at Haverhill upon the subject in such a manner as must, I think, lead him to be more cautious. And later on, he says, however, I depend much upon the alteration which is soon to take place in his situation. Sorry, my screen turned off here. Than upon any advice or counsel that I can ever give him. I am well convinced that if anything can keep him within the limits of regularity, it will be his knowledge of my father being near him and the fear of being discovered by him. And I discussed in my original article about this that that's kind of weird. It was sort of some weird language for how he's reprimanding Charles there, telling him to be cautious and stuff, because it seems like if if Charles had kind of gone back to like partying or being drunken and crazy or anything, as we saw in his college years, it seems like cautious might not have been the word that he would have used. Maybe telling him to behave more decently. And I don't know. I feel like there's a lot of different adjectives that he could have used, but he specifically says cautious, as though the thing that Charles is doing, the big issue is not that he's doing it, but that people might find out about it. So to me, that seemed like that could hint more at, it's something like same-sex interaction, something that's like more taboo and illicit. But we'll get more into Charles's sexuality kind of going on. So John Adams does come to, I don't remember, I think they're maybe in New York at this time. And John Adams, possibly in Philadelphia, but John Adams looks into getting Charles, into a law office somewhere where Charles can be a clerk and kind of, that's like sort of the first step into your career as a lawyer at the time. And he ends up getting Charles in with Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was an established lawyer by that point. And so Charles begins working as a clerk for him. And it's there that Charles meets John Mulligan. And I talked about this a little bit in the last episode with Steuben. But it seems Charles Adams and John Mulligan start to grow really close and they move in together. And this seems to have upset Charles's parents. And we don't have a ton of like record of that, of exactly like what their problem was, but they seemed concerned by the fact that he was so close to John Mulligan and that they had moved in together and they were spending a lot of time together. So they end up eventually trying to look for, somewhere they can go, like kind of a way that they can be safe together in their relationship. And I had some notes in my article here about like what John Adams's attitudes were and what Abigail Adams' attitudes were as far like like homophobia. I mean, not necessarily the right term for it, but like what record we do have of their thoughts on men who pursued relationships with men. John Adams, from what we can see, seems to have been like pretty homophobic. There's not like a ton of direct references to anything queer related in his writings, but we do have a few quotes from him. For instance, we have one where he says something about, he says that Napoleon was, quote, made to inflict 10,000 lashes on the back of Europe as a divine punishment and vengeance for the atheism, infidelity, fornications, adulteries, incest, and sodomies, unquote. So Yeah, he makes a couple of comments, I think even within I think that was, like, a letter to a friend, but, about, like, hoping that sodomites will be purged from the earth at some point. So, yeah, John Adams is pretty decently what we might call, like, violently homophobic, sort of, is what we're seeing from his writings. Um, from a lot of Abigail Adams's stuff, we're not really seeing that same kind of, like, fire and brimstone sort of attitude, but we are seeing, you know, what we might kind of expect, some, like, little comments about, sort of joking about or looking down on, like, more effeminate men. She uses the word fop, and Bo a couple of times talk about, like, men who are, like, overly fashionable and overly concerned about their appearance. Um, so that's like a bit, it's a bit different, but yeah, definitely some stuff going on with both Abigail and John Adams that might give us some insight into how they were seeing it if they did suspect that Charles Adams and John Mulligan were having a relationship. Um, so yeah, they try to once again kind of use shame and showing disapproval and kind of guilt him into um, not spending as much time with John Mulligan, um, not being as close with him. But this does not end up working this time, and so we don't know exactly how this all plays out. But at some point, um, they apparently talk. Charles Adams talks to Hamilton about this, and Hamilton puts Charles Adams and John Mulligan in touch with Baron von Steuben. And I talked in my last episode about the high likelihood that Steuben um, was same gender attracted, and how it seems that that was pretty well known at the time, and that Steuben was actually able to kind of create like a small community of other men who may have also been same gender attracted, and he was kind of able to create like sort of safe spaces there. Um, and so, yeah, this seems like it might be a continuation of that. Hamilton puts him in contact with Steuben. Um, and they actually end up moving in with Steuben, and they both live with Steuben for about a year. At the end of the year, Charles goes back to the city to start his legal career. He is a fully certified lawyer at this point. Um, but yeah, John Mulligan continues living with Steuben and will actually live with Steuben until Steuben's death. So yeah, Charles did go back to the city. He did, however, remain close with Mulligan. He continued to visit him a lot and correspond with him. Um, he also joined this society. This one historian, Bob Arnebeck, talked about this a bit in his article about Charles Mulligan that I think I have in my sources on the article, and I think there's a link to. It's called "To Tease and Torment Two Presidents Confront Suspicions of Sodomy." And so, yeah, he talks a lot about Charles Adams and the stuff going on with his life. And one of the things he mentioned was Charles Adams joining this group called the Friendly Club, that was sort of this like book club and discussion group that talked about philosophy and was like kind of forward thinking. And um, yeah, they met regularly, and a lot of like at least a decent number of their members, like more than we would normally know of, seem to have maybe been queer. Um, and it wouldn't necessarily, I talked to Bob Arnebeck about this, and he said it wouldn't necessarily be accurate to say that it was like a 100% like gay club, that it was just guys who were attracted to men. Um, but um, what's that comment? Someone, I come and pasted something, but I don't know that second word. Was there a word that I mentioned that you wanted me to explain? We can come back to that, I guess. But oh, the two words Abigail Adams used. Yeah, I mentioned Fop and Bo. Because Bo is actually not one that I've seen as much. Um, and I don't remember if when I read this or if when I wrote this article, I mean, if I had more um detail on what all that meant. Yeah, it she seems to use it the same way that she uses like fop, that she's using it to refer to like an over fashionable young man. Where was the quote she had about that? Yeah, the quote where she used it, she said, "I do not wish a senator to dress like a beau, but I want him to conform so far to the fashion as not to incur the character of singularity." Um, so yeah, that seems to be what she means, like over fashionable, maybe like kind of effeminate, like caring too much about his appearance. Um, yeah, it's not a word that I included in my article on terms that were used. Um, and so yeah, I couldn't tell you exactly what it means, but she seems to have been using it the same way. And so what we can definitely get from it, for the purposes of this discussion, is that she did sort of have this like joking but kind of narrow-minded disdain towards men being like, yeah, any men that she felt were overly fashionable or that she felt were kind of feminine, that she, yeah, she definitely had like an idea of like this kind of man is not as respectable, and it seemed to have like a lot of sort of like queer coded elements to that. AJC mentions the Abigail Adams didn't support slavery, but was scandalized after seeing a Romeo and Juliet play with a black Romeo. Um, yeah, that kind of makes sense. Both John and Abigail Adams, I think, at least claim to be anti slavery, and I believe that they actually never owned slaves. And I think John Adams was like one of the only founders who definitely never owned slaves. Um, which is very cool. But definitely in that era, anti slavery and anti racist are not the same things. And you do see a lot of people who can recognize that slavery is wrong and incredibly inhumane and cruel, um, but are still racist in some ways to some degree. So yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if she was, yeah, still reacting negatively to that. And yeah, see, I Come in Peace asked if the woman playing Juliet was white, and that would definitely, yeah, have added to the scandal at the time if this production was having a mixed race Romeo and Juliet couple. Um, but yeah, so that is an interesting thing for sure about the Adamses. Um, and yeah, I believe that John said it was like a religious objection that he didn't own slaves. And that's not necessarily to say that he was necessarily against slavery, because I think he did make some comments about that he felt that slavery was kind of natural and like always a thing that was going to be part of society. But he did feel that he could not engage in it. Um, but yeah, that's interesting that Abigail Adams didn't support slavery. She was a very interesting person in a lot of ways. But yeah, so where were we in this story? Yeah, so Charles Adams became a lawyer. Yeah, just looking at the comments again. Yeah, so the Juliet being white. Yeah, that is crazy that there would be that production to begin with, as you pointed out. Um, and yeah, and Abigail Adams went to it. That is very interesting, and that kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about like, you know, like societies in the past not being like uniform. Um, so yeah, like, you know, 18th century United States being obviously a very racist place doesn't mean that there wasn't anyone there, who was, yeah, kind of testing society's boundaries and trying to do different things, um, and create, yeah, a different space there. But yeah, and it is interesting that you should go to that to begin with. So that's definitely something that I would like to know more about. So yeah, as I was saying, so yeah, Charles Adams became a lawyer, went back to the city. Yeah, so he joined that group, the Friendly Club, that it wasn't necessarily like a queer group, but it had a lot of queer members and seemed to have been generally sort of accepting of queer stuff and just a lot of like different discussions in general. Um, and Charles Adams became very active in that group and very close with a couple of the members. And as we'll see later, he ends up getting married, and that does not necessarily it doesn't end his involvement in the Friendly Club or his involvement necessarily with John Mulligan, and he does not invite any members of that club to his wedding. He kind of seems to be keeping like these two like threads of his life separate. Yeah, and he ended up because he got married in 1795. He married a woman named Sally Smith, um, who was actually kind of his like sister-in-law. I think she was his sister's husband's sister. So he married into the same family that his sister married into, and I think they may have actually been related to them as well. They may have been distinct cousins of some kind, um, which we do see a little bit of in this time. So yeah, he married Sally Smith in 1795. He had actually courted her before, um, not long after getting out of college. I think he had courted her briefly. His parents made him end that relationship because he was not yet established in a career and he was not in a place where he was ready to support a family. Um, and at that time, you do kind of have the, like sort of heavy emphasis on dating for marriage. Not that people didn't have relationships just to do it, just for fun, but that's not what his parents wanted from him. Um, and so, yeah, he was forced to break up with her. And then, yeah, a few years later, he marries her. And there's no evidence of them being engaged or courting again. And so, a lot of historians have concluded that in 1795, they just kind of eloped, um, which is interesting. It does, I think, suggest that that he may have been genuinely attracted to her because he's not being like forced into this relationship. This seems to be a relationship he's having against his parents' wishes. I see in the chat AJC clarified it was Othello and not Romeo and Juliet. That's kind of interesting because Othello, like I think he's supposed to be black, and so it's like sad that it was scandalous that he actually was. Yeah, that's interesting. But I guess like yeah, probably a lot of productions didn't let him be um probably yeah, just men in blackface playing Othello for a while. Yeah, Confused mentioned, yeah, diegetically Othello is black. Yeah, yeah, this is discussed in the plot, but yeah, so that's sad that was yeah, I know there's like, the Orson Welles movie is yeah, uses blackface. So yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting to think of like, yeah, going to like a very progressive production where we're actually letting Othello be black. But it is interesting. I think it does say a lot that people of the time that Abigail Adams and others were actually going to that, whether that's because they were kind of progressive or because they're using people of color kind of as a spectacle, which we do kind of see happen throughout the 1700s. But yeah, so going back to Charles Adams. Um, so yeah, he, against his parents' wishes, courted Sally Smith. He breaks up with her for a while and then elopes with her in 1795. As I mentioned, he keeps very separate his life with his family. He ends up having two daughters, but his wife with his daughters and his wife he keeps very separate from his life with like John Mulligan and Baron von Steuben and the Friendly Club. So he seems to kind of be living these sort of two lives at that time. His first daughter is born in 1796. His daughter Susanna. So the year after he gets married, his second daughter Abigail is born in 1798. And then in October of 1799, Charles Adams's life seems to kind of implode and his marriage is abruptly over. John Adams goes to visit his daughter, and Charles Adams's wife, Sally, and Charles's children are living there at the same time. A lot of historians have said like, oh, see, Charles must have left her and abandoned her and the children, and she went to stay with his sister, but we know so little about what happened with the end of his marriage and this period of his life that there's actually no more evidence that he left her than that she left him. Um, so we don't actually know either way what happened there. Um, John Adams writes, I think he writes this to Abigail after having this conversation with Sally. He says, Sally opened her mind to me for the first time. I pitied her, I grieved, I mourned, but could do no more. A madman possessed of the devil can alone express or represent. I renounce him. King David's Absalom had some ambition and some enterprise. Mine is a mere rake, buck, blood, and beast. So something has gone very wrong, and Charles's marriage is over. And after Sally talks to John about this, John decides to basically disown his son. There's some debate as to all that may have actually gone wrong in their relationship. And we look at what all John said here. He mentions Absalom. I'm probably saying that name wrong, but that seemed to just be a reference. From what I could find, like I didn't know that much about it. Bob Arnebeck explains that it seemed to just be a biblical reference to a disobedient son, more than any specific crime there. Of course, the word rake is sort of the male version in the era of like the word like whore or slut. Obviously, it's sad that those words should be specifically female, but that's kind of how they were used at the time. So rake is kind of an equivalent that, yeah, he's too sexually licentious and in like a shameful way. So he's a rake. He used the term buck, which I found could mean like stylish, effeminate, or undisciplined. So it's interesting that those things kind of combined. But yeah, so just mean kind of like wild, and also, yeah, the fact that stylish and effeminate are grouped into it as well is kind of interesting. Goes back to, sort of John and Abigail's shared horror of any men who were not like, fitting their definition of masculine. I couldn't find anything of like beast, obviously, like just kind of means what it means. I'm not sure if there would have been any other like connotations, but I couldn't find anything of like what blood meant. Yeah, because his mind is a mere rake, buck, blood, and beast. So I don't know what blood means there at all. The only thing I could kind of think of was maybe his point is like he's biologically connected to Charles, and that's like the only connection that he wants with him anymore. I'm not sure. So I don't know what all is going on there. But yeah, so that's kind of mysterious. He doesn't really give us a lot of specific detail as to what is going on with Charles. Of course, we could try to look back on like what's going on, because obviously Charles's life probably didn't just fall apart here in October. What's going on with him in that year? But we don't have basically anything from Charles for the whole year. The last piece of written correspondence we have from him is in February, a letter he wrote to his father, I think, and I think that's the last thing that we ever see from Charles, the last like thing he ever writes. And it was just like a very normal letter. So there's really like just sort of like silence around whatever happened in the last year of his life. After his death, Abigail would mention him being an alcoholic, and she said that that was kind of the cause of his problems. But Bob Arnebeck and other historians have pointed out that John doesn't mention that in all of the things that he lists. He doesn't mention Charles being an alcoholic in any of the things we have where he's talking about disowning Charles and being disgusted with Charles's actions. That never comes up for him, which I think is kind of interesting. I don't know if that points to like, yeah, inconsistency, that maybe there's other stuff going on, or if he maybe just thought, kind of listing these vague, like he's fallen into shamefulness and wildness, that maybe alcoholism can be inferred from that, or that that's covered in that. it seems like he may have been an alcoholic because she was really upset about that, and he did get in trouble at Harvard for drinking. Um, but there is, yeah, some evidence to suggest that that was maybe not the whole problem or the only problem happening in his life. Um, and yet that often gets like assumed to be like kind of what was causing all of his problems. Um, Additionally, people often say that he died of like cirrhosis of the liver, I believe. Um, but like they describe what he ended up dying of. I believe they refer to it as like dropsy of the chest. So he, it's kind of vague, and we have to sort of piece together like what 18th century medical terms meant. But it seems like there's a couple of things that they could have meant. Maybe like some lung diseases. It like involves like some swelling and like some like fluids being in your chest, and it's not really more. That term is not really more specific than that. Um, it could refer to something like tuberculosis. It could also refer to some kind of cancer. Charles's sister later ends up dying of breast cancer. And I think I mentioned in my article that it's possible that that may have been what killed him too. Um, you know, cisgender men can get breast cancer. Um, so it's possible that he died of something else, and people often assume that he died of his alcoholism. So it seems like there may have been a lot of stuff going on in his life that kind of just gets like, um, yeah, categorized under, well, Abigail said he was an alcoholic, but it seems like there might have been a number of things going on. So yeah, he ends up dying November 31st. Um, Yeah. Well, it looks like, yeah, he actually dies in 1800. I'd forgotten. So it's, yeah, it's more than a year, I guess, after like the last correspondence we have from him. So yeah, like the last almost 2 years of his life are very shrouded in mystery. Um, in the final weeks of his life, his wife Sally actually does visit him a number of times. She doesn't necessarily seem to hate him. Um, Although their marriage is definitely over, they never lived together after October of 1799. His sister also visits him frequently, and his mother visits him a few times. But John Adams stays true to his promise never to see Charles again, and he never does. Um, and yeah, after his death, they do kind of try to cover up that any of this happened and sort of move on and pretend almost that he didn't exist. Some historians have suggested that's what Abigail's family did as well with her brother, who was also an alcoholic. Um, they kind of engage in this weird family cover up. Um, but yeah, so I go back to my article here and look at this. But yeah, and just, at the end of my article, I talked about, how like completely forgotten he's been, how thoroughly he ended up being covered up by his family, and how like kind of mysterious it all became and how little we know about him. Um, so yeah, that's kind of where we're at with Charles Adams. Um, so yeah, I don't really know how to end that story other than, yeah, it kind of ended up shrouded in secrecy and he kind of disappears there. I do think that there is the possibility of him having been same gender attracted, in his relationship that we see with John Mulligan. And we don't know a ton about that, but he obviously became very close with Mulligan. And then, going to Steuben for help with that relationship when we've seen this pattern of, Steuben being openly queer and people knowing that that's something that he knows about. Um, and then his involvement in the Friendly Club and with some of the members in that, and how he ends up kind of living this double life with some people in society who were possibly queer, and then just this life that he's supposed to be living. AJC mentioned John Quincy's quote in the letter. He says something about "May silence fall on his grave." Yeah, I think I do remember that. Um, Yeah, I don't remember exactly what letter that's from. Maybe I have it here. Let me look. But yeah, like I said, there definitely does end up being like a kind of cover up. Yeah, I don't know. I don't have that letter here. Um, but yeah, they do all kind of um, agree not to discuss anything that happened to Charles afterwards. And yeah, John Adams certainly talks about him pretty much never after that and never mentions him. I come piece asks what happened to John Mulligan after this point. Yeah, I mean, he kept living with Steuben, and he lived with Steuben for a couple of years. Um, for a number of years after that. I don't remember exactly when Steuben died. Let me look that up. Yeah, so Steuben ends up dying in 1794. And so, yeah, John Mulligan lived with him until then, um, and ended up inheriting like a decent number of, like a decent percentage of Steuben's money and possessions. Um, yeah, and we talked about him a little bit in the last episode, how he's one of the people that like some of our stories of Steuben come from. I don't really know what happened to John Mulligan after Steuben's death. Um, I couldn't really say. And yeah, he becomes very close with Steuben. Um, and I think he possibly referred to Steuben as being like a parent to him at some point. Yeah, AJC mentioned it's interesting and sad how they just decided to erase a relative. He doesn't seem to have done anything incredibly awful. Yeah, I mean, like, since there is like so much mystery around what he yeah, what happened with him, like, maybe he did something bad. Um, John talks about how much he pitied, John Adams talks about how much he pitied, Sally, and so maybe we could, like, extrapolate that to some sort of, maybe Charles Mulligan being or sorry, not Charles Mulligan, Charles Adams being, abusive or something, but we don't, yeah, have any evidence for that. We don't really have any evidence for anything bad that he did other than, yeah, that he just didn't end up being what his parents wanted him to be. He didn't end up filling into this, story that they were constructing for him and for themselves. AJC mentioned something about the letter about telling Charles to practice caution was less than a year before he stood in front of Alexander Hamilton with an introductory letter. Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting. Yeah, as you point out too, the thing with yeah, John Quincy mentioning that, yeah, like, oh, well, our father is coming back into town, and so he'll keep Charles Adams in line. It's kind of weird and sad because Charles Adams is like a grown man by this point. Um, yeah, AJC mentions, I remember thinking, what would your young adult child have to do for you to think that level of babysitting was necessary? Yeah, that is definitely interesting. Like his family, like the level of concern they have, yeah, is like super off the charts. Because yeah, John Quincy Adams, and I have like more specifics of it, my article here. But yeah, he's really freaked out about whatever it was that happened, that his friend writes to him about to begin with. Um, and as I mentioned, I don't think that we have that letter, but where is it? Okay, yeah. So it's the John Quincy gets this letter from his cousin William Cranch telling him that Charles did something. Um, but yeah, John Quincy Adams interrupted like all of the stuff that he was doing in his professional life at that time to go and see his brother Charles. And yeah, he seems very concerned. Yeah, obviously this is like considered like yeah, a definite family emergency that he has to go and talk to Charles about whatever it is that Charles has become um, caught up in. And that, yeah, then they have to have John Adams there keeping an eye on him and telling Charles, that he needs to be more cautious is very interesting. Yeah, AJC mentions very what would the neighbors think. Yeah, there's definitely yeah, this whole thing that his family is doing in terms of like just to build their image. Um, but yeah, I think that yeah, definitely like looking back on this article as I have written it, I would like to revisit Charles Adams at some point and learn more about him because I feel like the information I have is a bit sparse. Um, but yeah, they're definitely very concerned and it's definitely something very scandalous. Um, I think, if he were um, doing these things, like 2 centuries later, it would probably be like, oh, is his family concerned that he's a communist or something? There's something he's engaging in that, yeah, they're so worried about how this is going to destroy his reputation and theirs. And yeah, it doesn't seem like that's necessarily him being an alcoholic. As I mentioned, Abigail's family did kind of erase her brother, who is an alcoholic. So that could be, but yeah, with him talking, John Quincy Adams talking about like exercise caution and father's going to watch you to make sure this kind of stuff isn't happening again. Um, yeah, seems to me like something that yeah, it just doesn't feel like that language necessarily fits with, the idea of Charles maybe being an alcoholic, and, yeah, I feel like there's definitely, like, a lot of secrecy going on there. But, yeah, and I think that all, like, pairs very interestingly with the evidence that we do have maybe that, he was queer. Yeah, Icon Peace mentioned maybe Charles became an alcoholic to deal with the way his family saw him slash treated him. That's definitely what, Bob Arnebeck suggested, yeah. Um, and yeah, as I said, it does seem to be like that he was living this sort of double life because I mentioned, he has these social circles that don't cross, with his family and then with his friends, many of whom we have other evidence were queer. Um, so yeah, he does end up living this sort of double life as time goes on. And yeah, I agree that perhaps him becoming an alcoholic um, ends up being as a result of whatever was going on in his life. It wasn't, that's not what the big secret was. Um, Additionally, I don't think that the main thing they were concerned about with him was him being an alcoholic because it seems like whatever the main thing was, um, they destroyed letters about. They, kept very hush hush, and then him being an alcoholic is the thing that Abigail is actually willing to talk about. AJC mentions even the HBO miniseries, which doesn't portray Charles in a positive way at all, shows him being yelled at a lot as a little kid. That's very sad. Yeah, the one thing that the documentary evidence that we have makes very clear is that John Adams hated his son, and so we can kind of debate why and what was going on there. But yeah, clearly he really hated Charles. Yeah, I haven't actually seen all of the HBO miniseries, so I don't know about how they portray Charles in that. Um, but that's interesting that they portray him in, I guess, something of a negative light. I don't know if that's like to protect John Adams or if they're extrapolating from the evidence we have and using it to suggest that maybe there was something bad that he did, which would be somewhat reassuring to think that his family only did this because he had done something bad, but I don't know that we actually know that. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, JC mentions the book it was written based on was before queer historians are very loud and involved. Yeah, absolutely. I think that is like, because sometimes people will think it's weird to get particularly involved in queer history because it's like, well, being queer is just like a small part of a person. They have like this whole other life and everything. And, that's not the most important thing about someone. And I think that, well, that's true. It is like a key element, it is like a thing, a part of like a piece of the puzzle. And so then when people are writing about things that are not directly related to queer history, um, and developing these other narratives, learning about this other stuff, but then they're missing that part with queer history. Um, it does end up throwing off the whole rest of other stories. Trying to tell the story of John Adams's life and how, yeah, his career and his family intersected and stuff, and not having this full picture of what was going on with Charles. Yeah, AJC says Charles is portrayed as an angry man who felt slighted by being abandoned when Abigail joined John in Europe, and an alcoholic. Yeah, I do think this definitely sounds unfair, to just show him as, yeah, like just being bitter about. And for one thing, like I think it's probably reasonable to be a bit bitter if your parents keep leaving you to go to Europe for extended periods of time. But then, yeah, to just say that all of his problems come from that when there's obviously like his family was being awful to him in a lot of ways. Yeah, and it does. I mean, like I said, it seems like he may have been an alcoholic. Um, it wouldn't surprise me if, yeah, if he actually was, based on the evidence that we do have. But yeah, I do think that this idea of him being alcoholic, yeah, it kind of gets turned into like that was the cause and symptom of all of his problems, and that was all that was going on with him. Um, and yeah, I think definitely some more research needs to be done before we can say, like, with any certainty that he was queer. Although I don't know, like the stuff with Steuben, I think is somewhat convincing. Um, Automatically, when a historical figure becomes close friends with Steuben, I feel like it's like, what's going on there? Um, but yeah, there's definitely a lot more research that needs to be done before um, we can necessarily say for sure that Charles was queer. But I think that is a strong possibility that kind of fills in some of the blanks in this story. Icon P says Team Steuben, which I think he actually said earlier as well, and I didn't get a chance to react to that. But yeah, Steuben was an interesting guy, and I'm definitely going to revisit him at some point as well. Um, yeah, the way that he seems to have created these families and this network. Um, and yeah, if we knew more about Charles Adams and John Mulligan, it would develop that story further. But yeah, definitely some interesting things going on with Steuben. We can see when people get pulled into that inner circle, it's like, maybe this person was queer. And then some of Steuben's other friends, he was definitely friends with some people who weren't queer. But then that often gives us an interesting chance to see how some of these historical figures are perceiving queer people. We see John Adams being incredibly homophobic, um, wanting Napoleon to kill, same gender attracted men and whatnot, and then being friends with Steuben. And as I mentioned, Adams did not dislike Steuben. Um, I mentioned in the article, I kind of skipped over some of this for this adaptation because I wasn't sure it was as relevant. But Adams, even after Charles Adams and John Mulligan move in with Steuben, John Adams is never hostile towards Steuben. He, includes well wishes for Steuben in letters to Charles while Charles is living with Steuben. And in one letter, they're discussing New York politics, and John says, "What says the wise baron to all of this?" So, like, he doesn't dislike Steuben, even though he thinks that perhaps Steuben you know, if he was maybe aware of Steuben's queerness, it seems like a number of people were, that he viewed that in this very negative light, that he was definitely able to have this very, hate the sin, love the sinner kind of attitude about it. AJC says, I think there were two reasons Hamilton was living rent free in Adams's head decades after his death, him not supporting him for president when Washington stepped down, and whatever happened between Hamilton and Charles. Definitely seems to have had fatherly moments with Charles, otherwise he wouldn't have come back to ask for help to be introduced to Steuben. Yeah. Yeah, certainly Hamilton did develop this close relationship um, with Charles Adams. I think I had another thing about Hamilton's relationship with Charles, and it's not in my original article, so I don't remember which of my things it came up in. Maybe it was one of Adams's other relatives that I was thinking of. But yeah, so it is definitely very interesting, Adams being political enemies with Hamilton, and then the son that he disowns becoming close friends with Hamilton. Um, yeah, it's an interesting part of Adams and Hamilton's dynamic, and definitely something that drove Adams crazy. So yeah, I think that probably when Charles moves in with Steuben, Adams is more mad at Hamilton for sure than at Steuben. Um, yeah, and I definitely agree that it would be interesting to know more about Hamilton and Charles Adams's relationship. Um, yeah, because I mean, I talked about in my previous episode and in this one how Steuben comes into this story, saying that like it's because Steuben was somewhat openly queer that it makes sense for a young queer person in need to be sent to him. But yeah, the fact that Charles approaches Hamilton for that he's in need and goes to Hamilton. Um, yeah, I don't know if I had anything else about that in the original article. I don't think I did, but it's definitely very interesting that like that would be Charles's move at all. Yeah, and so I think that definitely was an interesting aspect of Hamilton's dynamic with Adams. So I think we'll wrap this live stream up here. Um, definitely planning to revisit Charles at some point because it seems like, yeah, he has a very interesting story that I'd like to know more about and how he fits into this. Once I finish adapting my old articles, what I really want to move on to is sort of more of like, yeah, if there were maybe sort of like queer networks happening at this time in the US and like how this is like affecting politics. And yeah, these relationships beyond like personal romantic relationships, but like, yeah, just how this like community gets forged and like the impact it has on the wider community. But yeah, I come piece of this is really interesting. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thank you to everyone who came. We had some good discussion, and I'm glad that that we could all discuss this story more. So I'll put on Instagram when I plan on doing my next live stream. I'm hoping to do one sometime next week, but I don't know if that will end up being possible or not. AJC said no problem. I enjoyed this. Can't wait for more. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, everyone have a good rest of your evening, and we'll talk about more queer history soon.